we can begin our conversation this afternoon. India is a country of 1.3 billion people and is governed by a political system that is ostensibly democratic, in that every 5 years, hundreds of millions of Indians cast votes to elect a new government in power at the center. Smaller, though no less significant, elections take place at the state level. Even right now, the states of Tamil Nadu, Kerala, West Bengal, and Assam are in the midst of state assembly elections. The dominant narrative shaping American perspectives of India is that it too, like the good old USA, is a democracy. Every American president reiterates tired cliches about quote unquote shared democratic values, our two democracies, and so on. The latest round of this, which happened during the last American president's term in a scripted hugfest with the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi held in Houston, home to some of Modi's most fanatical supporters. While there is a lot to be said for how democracy is imperfect, a work in progress, and so on, the fetishization of process over substance reeks of a deeper malaise that shapes politics in India ever since it won independence from the British colonial power in 1947. The unfinished struggle for democratization, waged by hundreds of millions of India's poor, socially and economically marginalized peoples. It is this struggle for democratization that brought so many ordinary and extraordinary people into various forms of mobilization and struggle. Struggles invariably demanding basic rights enshrined in the Indian Constitution. Itself, the product of a decades-long struggle waged by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, a Dalit, who as the architect of the Constitution sought to instill social justice, egalitarianism, and the end of oppressive social practices into its premises and promises. Thus, part of the story underlying the gap separating formal democracy from struggles for democratization is the unfulfilled and betrayed promises of the Constitution. Yes, Indians vote in massive numbers, but let us also note that Indians also strike and protest in large numbers, as evidenced by the massive protests that unfolded in the wake of the Modi regime's efforts to impose new citizenship laws that would effectively disenfranchise India's 130 million Muslims, or the 100 plus million workers who marched last year, the largest strike in human history against neoliberal reforms being pushed by the Modi regime. Or more recently, the ongoing massive farmers' protests, with millions of agriculturists still camped outside Delhi, demanding the withdrawal of new laws designed to destroy the small farmer and empower corporate stranglehold of food production. Yes, Indians in the millions may vote, but they also enthusiastically demand rights and justice in the face of insurmountable odds. And do not take lightly the promises and premises of rights, justice, and liberty. It is this energy, this unbowed determination, that I will label the urge for democratization, that the present rulers of India, not unlike those who preceded them, view with suspicion, contempt, and fear, and are doing their best to crush and erase with every tool available at their disposal, including the planting of false evidence, the deployment of fascistic mobs, and incessant propagandizing in media and through social media, justifying these assaults. This webinar will focus on a specific case in which 16 prominent public figures have been accused of supporting Maoism and subsequently incarcerated. The individuals targeted by the Modi regime, the so-called Bhima Koregaon 16, have all been associated in one way or another with struggles to democratize life by defending and advocating for the legal rights and social dignity of Dalits, Adivasis, women, working class poor, minority communities, as well as victims of the armed state apparatus such as Kashmiris under brutal Indian military occupation, or political prisoners locked up, tortured, and abused under tyrannical laws erected under the cloud of anti-terrorism legislation in recent decades. They include Dr. Anand Teltumde, perhaps the most important public intellectual in India today, a Dalit scholar, engineer, writer, and activist, whose scholarly work is highly regarded in India and across the world as critical to an understanding of the political economy of caste and anti-Dalit violence in the neoliberal era. They include Father Stan Swami, an 81-year-old Jesuit priest, beloved by Dalits, Adivasis, and many other poor marginalized people, for his steadfast and lifelong commitment to defending the poor against state and state-supported forms of violence. They include Sudha Bhardwaj, the people's lawyer as she is popularly known, a scholar activist with decades of teaching and legal activism, working with, to just list a few, the People's Union for Civil Liberties, PUCL, Women Against Sexual Violence and State Repression, WSS, and as a founding member of the Indian Association of People's Lawyers. The list includes Varavara Rao, an 81-year-old poet considered a giant of Telugu literature, Gautam Navlaka, veteran journalist associated for decades with the People's Union for Democratic Rights, PUDR, and the famous journal Economic and Political Weekly, well known for his public criticism of the egregious violence of Indian troops in Kashmir and in the violent counter-insurgency operations that subject Adivasi communities to regular state brutality in central India. A full list of the 16 individuals incarcerated by the Modi regime in the Bhima Koregaon 16 case is available on the website indiacivilwatch.org. I would now like to take a couple of minutes to introduce our panelists today before we begin our conversation. Dr. Jedediah Crandall, Associate Professor at the Biodesign Center for Biocomputing, Security and Society, and the School of Computing, Informatics and Decision Systems Engineering at Arizona State University, is a computer scientist whose area of expertise spans operating systems, networks, computer architecture, and cybersecurity. He is a leading expert on measuring censorship and surveillance in order to develop a sense of how the internet changes over time. Combining novel data collection methods and measurements, reverse engineering, and social media analysis, his research and professional expertise is directed towards understanding how systems could be adapted to help protect at-risk people such as journalists or activists from malicious networks. As a key member of the online platform NetAlert, a collaborative project between Open Effect, the Citizen Lab, and at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, University of Toronto, Dr. Crandall directs the translation of new research on privacy and security issues into clear messages explaining how online threats work and what ordinary computer users can do about them. This critical work has produced technical explainers to help make research more accessible to wider audiences and has assisted computer users and activists across the world to defend privacy and challenge intrusive and repressive efforts by governments or private players. Dr. Aparna Sundar is a political scientist who teaches at the Asian Institute at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. Dr. Sundar's research spans a gamut of sites and theoretical interests, including immigrant and labor organizing in Toronto, counter movements against commodification in India's fisheries, the subaltern politics of secularism, and the entanglements of sovereignty and development in civil wars in South Asia. Her current research falls into two broad areas. One, precariousness and livelihoods, and two, democratic politics and contemporary struggles over the meanings of democracy, which includes two collaborative comparative projects, one on authoritarian populisms and the other on neoliberalization, precarity, and contentious politics in the BRICS countries. Her work has been published in Globalization, Journal of South Asian Development, Economic and Political Weekly, Conservation and Society, and in several edited book volumes. Described by the journal Economic and Political Weekly as, quote, an important contribution in terms of its embrace of an ethnographic approach to the dynamics of actually existing sovereignty in times of conflicts and wars, end quote, her co-edited volume titled Civil Wars in South Asia, State Sovereignty Development, is an important intervention in a field dominated by modes of analysis that ignore the needs, aspirations, desires, receiving end of power. Dr. Balmurli Natarajan is Professor of Anthropology in the Department of Community Development and Social Justice at William Paterson University of New Jersey. As an anthropologist, marine engineer, and software developer by training, his research and teaching is on group formation, identity and inequality, culture and multiculturalism, and globalization / international development. Dr. Natarajan's book, Culturalization of Caste in India, Identity and Inequality in a Multicultural Age, which was published in 2011, is on the new modes of persistence of caste in India. And his co-edited volume, Against Stigma, Studies in Caste, Race and Justice since Durban, published in 2009, is on the global discourse of race and caste. His current work is on one aspect of global health, the adoption of toilets as a social practice in India. His approach to teaching globalization to working class and historically underprivileged students was featured in the Chronicle of Higher Education. Dr. Natarajan has several scholarly and popular essays on food and representational politics, domestic workers and dignity, democracy and ultranationalism, and caste, race, and multiculturalism. He has served on the American Anthropological Association's Committee on Minority Issues, leads efforts around diversity, equity, and justice at William Paterson University, and is actively engaged in solidarity work. Dr. Natarajan's publications, including media and popular essays, are also available for your reference on his webpage. I want to welcome each one of you to this panel. Thank you all for taking the time and for agreeing to share your insights and knowledge on this very important though complex topic. So I want to begin by posing the first round of questions. And this is directed primarily at Doctors Natarajan and Sundar. The main purpose is to gain some kind of clarity as to what this issue is about. What is this case? What is the Bhima Koregaon case? Is my question. And if you could kind of elaborate as you kind of unpack your answer, who these individuals are who are incarcerated, and what we might, on the one hand, and secondly, what can we learn about what is going on under the Narendra Modi government's kind of twin focus, right? The push for kind of rapid neoliberalization of the economy, as well as this dogged pursuit of a Hindutva project to, quote unquote, and I will kind of use a phrase used by a kind of founding father of the Hindutva movement, V.D. Savarkar, Modi's objective to Hinduize politics and militarize Hinduism in every which way possible, as it is unfolding in various kinds of violence in India today. So what may we learn from the Bhima Koregaon case on these two counts about neoliberal, who's incarcerated and why, as well as this neoliberal agenda of the Modi regime and its sort of dogged pursuit of Hindutva as an objective? So, on to you.
Right. Thank you, Raja, so much. And Aparna, I guess I could just set the ball rolling. Thank you all for taking the time to attend this very important webinar. Let me just say a few brief words about Bhima Koregaon itself. And Raja has given us a really rich, broad frame. Bhima Koregaon is the name of a village/town which is in western India, just outside the city of Pune. And it is a historic site because it's the site of the last battle in 1818 that the British had against the local leaders, who are known as the Marathas, who are a dominant caste. They were also an example and a very important example, almost an exemplar of Brahminism. Now, the British won that war and they erected an obelisk, a very large obelisk. Probably Raja can share that photograph at some point to commemorate that victory. And now Dalits, who are India's ex-untouchable groups, who are around 18% of India's population today, but they were a very large part of the British Army, recruited very intentionally by the British, and continued to be given jobs in the army until about 1892. So now Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who is in some ways he stands for all Indians, as probably a cross between Frederick Douglass, the ex-slave, Martin Luther King, the prophetic leader, and even W.B. Du Bois, the incisive scholar. He happens to be India's the chief drafter of India's constitution, and he's a hugely symbolic leader of the Dalits, but also really of all progressive movements today in India. And he visited Bhima Koregaon sometime in the 1920s, and he gave that huge obelisk a symbolic power and made it as a symbol of Dalit struggle against casteism, and it has since been commemorated annually. Now, on December 31st, 2017, there was a move to commemorate the 200th anniversary of the Bhima Koregaon battle, and about 200 or more organizations, not only of Dalits but led by Dalits, but also of the other intermediate castes, including progressive Marathas, including many Muslim groups. All of them were convened by two retired judges or justices. One of them retired from India's Supreme Court and one of them from India's High Court. And this was convened by them, and this was known as the Elgar Parishad, or loosely translated, a loud invitation council. And the high point of that was that, several thousands attended it, and the high point was that they collectively pledged to uphold the Indian Constitution and also collectively pledged to work against what is known as the Hindutva regime today. Hindutva being a Hindu supremacist ultra-nationalist movement in India, which actually traces its history back to the late 19th century and is a very ideologically clear and extremely well organized machinery that we'll talk about more. But what happened is there was a riot that was fomented by some very well-known Hindutva operatives who are actually members of well-known Hindutva organizations. And in the ensuing riot that happened, with a large number of Dalits who were doing their annual pilgrimage to this site, one person was killed. And we now know that there was a first information report that was actually filed, which identified the two members of the Hindutva organizations, and that was not paid attention to by the police. And instead, what we then had was a systematic framing of a case, which has now come to be known as the Bhima Koregaon case. And that case was on several individuals, of which right now we have 16 very prominent ones that Raja started to mention, and Aparna will have more to say too. And that case was framed on these individuals who have been outspoken critics of the growing rise of Hindu supremacism, of authoritarian populism, and actually of fascism in India. And they are now known as the BK16. And the charges on them, and they have been arrested and they're all in jail right now. And the charges on them range from acting on behalf of, supposedly acting on behalf of a banned political organization called the Communist Party of India, Maoist. This is in the background of the fact that India has always had communist parties that have even participated and won elections. But there is this one kind of a organization which is mostly underground, and it has been banned, and the punishment is severe if anybody is shown to have actively helped or aided the Maoists in that way. So that is the main charge. And there are two other charges. One of them is that all these individuals were plotting to assassinate the Prime Minister, Narendra Modi. And the third charge is that they made several speeches at the Elgar Parishad, which is the conference that took place on 31st December 2017, and that those speeches were incendiary and things like that. Now, the plot against the Prime Minister, interestingly, was played up in the newspaper, and it completely disappeared in the several charge sheets that have now been filed after many months, sometimes even more than a year for some of the ones in prison. And the other two charges, that of acting on behalf of the Maoists and that of making inflammatory speeches at the Elgar Parishad, those are the two key charges. And the first charge is entirely based on digital evidence that our colleague Jed would have something to say about. And the second charge of inflammatory speeches is actually also very dubious because the entire conference was videographed. And till now, we've not seen a shred of evidence about any inflammatory evidence. In fact, both the judges who actually convened the conference have gone on record saying that none of these things are true and everything is up for the police and the public to see. And the only thing that anybody did there was actually pledge to hold up the Indian Constitution. Now, I just want to conclude by saying that this case has now come to be seen as very similar to the one in Turkey with Oda TV and what has now come to be known as the Ergenekon case. And we should have something to say about this because it is entirely based on fabricated forensics and the specter of a secret organization and the jailing of dissidents for supposedly having links to that organization. But in the process, every democratic rule has been flouted, from the seizing of the computers of those who are in prison to the arrest warrants itself that were not following any standard legal procedures, to a media trial long before any trial is even contemplated in the case, and the application of draconian laws of sedition that have long been talked about by India's human rights defenders as really unnecessary given India's already existing set of laws for all of these, the treatment of the imprisoned, and therefore all of this comes to the fact that the process itself has become the punishment with of the 16, several of them, the first 5 are now there for at least 2.5 years. So I hand it over to Aparna.
Thanks, Murli. I just want to add a little bit to that. I want to talk about the laws under which these 16 have been arrested, and then talk a little bit about the people themselves and the kind of work they do and who they are. So just to expand on what Murli said, the arrests have been carried out under what is now India's foremost anti-terror law, which is the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, or UAPA. And UAPA is a particularly draconian law which has been quite severely criticized by various human rights bodies like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, because essentially it allows for imprisonment it allows for arrest and imprisonment for up to 6 months before any kind of charges have to be filed. And it's also very hard to get bail under UAPA. So bail provisions have been made more and more difficult, and even things like the inadmissibility of evidence, false evidence, etc., cannot be used in a bail application. So it's an extremely sort of draconian law, and it's being increasingly used by this government. So a recent news stories show that the UAPA is now the use of the UAPA went up something like 72% between 2015 and 2019. So the BJP government's first term under Prime Minister Modi began in 1914. And from soon after that until the last date that we have statistics for, the last year we have statistics for 2019, it went up 72%. So in 2019, something like almost 2,000 people across the country were arrested under UAPA, with an especially high number in Kashmir. But students, all kinds of people engaged in very, very kind of harmless, simple activities of expressing dissent and protest. So that is the law under which all of these 16 are arrested, which is a problem in itself. And the law is being tried and the case is being prosecuted by India's National Investigation Agency. And again, there's a lot of irregularity in how the case was transferred to the National Investigation Agency, which works directly under the central government. So even though the arrests were first carried out by the police of the state of Maharashtra, and it was going to be prosecuted by the Maharashtra Pune police, when it looked like the new government, the non-BJP government in Maharashtra in early 2020 might have raised the cases or might have sort of had the cases reviewed, it was quickly moved to a central body that works directly with the Home Minister, the federal Home Minister. And so that itself also is another sign of how tightly managed this case is by the government at the center. So then just to go on to a little bit talk about who the 16 are, Raja already named several of them, and he gave a source of where we can find more about the others. But it's really worth mentioning that these are just stellar individuals, all of whom are involved in a variety of civil liberties and human rights activism. Several of them are academics. Anand Teltumde is a really, world-renowned professor, a very strong critic of both Hindutva, which we will be talking about shortly, the Hindu Nationalist Project, as well as of neoliberal economic policies. And then we have Dr. Shoma Sen, Sudha Bhardwaj, who's a lawyer as well as a professor of law in the National Law University in Delhi. Hani Babu, also a professor, an academic at Delhi University. We have other scholars like Gautam Navlakha. We have a very young and upcoming promising young scholar called Mahesh Raut, who had just won a prestigious Prime Minister's Rural Development Fellowship to work within an indigenous Adivasi community. So he, so early in his career, again, got arrested under these blown up charges, fake charges. A series of human rights lawyers, Vernon Gonzalez, Arun Ferreira, Surendra Gadling, as well as defenders and activists around civil liberties and especially defense of political prisoners and campaigns for the release of political prisoners, including Rona Wilson and Sudhir Davale, as well as activists, cultural activists, members of a group called the Kabir Kala Manch, so these three members are Sagar Gorkhe, Ramesh Gaichor, and Jyoti Jagtap. And then the Catholic priest, the 83-year-old Catholic priest, Stan Swami, who's really an incredible figure who's been active for decades in support of the defense of land and defense of resources by Adivasi or indigenous communities in central India. So these are people who've been active in a number of these kinds of issues. And what's most remarkable about them is that many of them are very well known. In fact, all of them are well known, and all of them have been active in defending the rights of less well known members of India's most marginalized communities, which are the Adivasis or indigenous communities, as well as the Dalit or oppressed castes, as well as women of these castes. So both Shoma Sen and Sudha Bhardwaj were part of an organization called Women Against Sexual Violence and State Repression, specifically addressing the ways in which these issues affect women in different, women facing militarization, arrest, etc. So what's interesting is that, and what's concerning is that these are prominent people who are lawyers and activists in defense of the human rights and civil liberties of less prominent people, and now the state has sort of decided that it doesn't even need to spare them. So even the fact that they have established positions, they have tenured positions in universities and so on, has not given them the kind of protection that traditionally people like themselves might have received. So I think that's, so what it does establish is that there is a kind of concerted attack not only on the kinds of issues of the people they're defending, which is land rights issues, resource issues, struggles against caste oppression, but that the government, the state has been willing to go to a new level in terms of who it's willing to arrest to silence questions being raised about these issues. Maybe I'll stop here now and then we can kind of develop a little bit more why they've been arrested and so why what the implications are.
Thank you, Dr. Sundar. Thank you, Dr. Natarajan. That really helped a lot to kind of flesh out and give us a little more detail in terms of who these folks are. And oftentimes, when thinking about repressive governments and the ways in which they oppress people, we tend to lose sight of the sort of the nitty gritty details of of who the human beings are at the receiving end of power. And thank you so much for bringing much needed detail there. Um, we'll come back to this whole question of Hindutva and neoliberalism, I suppose, as the conversation progresses. I want to turn now to Dr. Crandall and ask for your insights and thoughts. And some of us might be wondering, wow, this is a panel about fascism and repression, et cetera, et cetera. And we have a political scientist, an anthropologist, and a computer scientist. Well, we are definitely in an interesting historical moment where repressive forces are increasingly using various kinds of high-tech methods in order to, do what they do. And so, yes, it does stand to good reason that we have, for the purpose of getting some clarity here, the insights and knowledge and experience of uh, Dr. Crandall also. So, Dr. Crandall, could you tell us a little bit about the Arsenal report? This is a company that is based in the United States, and that produced this report that was, a kind of a bombshell earlier this year. That really kind of tore apart all of the claims that the Narendra Modi government and its investigative agencies had been making for years now. And what had been suspected a lot for a long time, exploded on the scene with this report. So could you tell us a little bit about the Arsenal report? What are its key findings? And perhaps, for those of us who are technically less kind of clued in to how all these things work, a little bit about how this malicious data got into the computer of one of the accused, Rona Wilson, whose hard drive was sort of the center of the analysis that went into this report. I think you're muted, Dr. Crandall. Can anybody hear? Can you speak now? We're not able to hear you, Dr. Crandall. Check and see whether in the participants list. I'm going to mute and ask to unmute and see if that works. You're still muted. Ask to unmute. Let me see. Can you speak now? We're not able to hear Dr. Crandall. So let's do one thing. We can kind of move to kind of the next set of questions here, and then we can come back to this as soon as Dr. Crandall joins us. And going back to the earlier point that both of you had kind of elaborated upon in terms of the Bhima Koregaon case and the people at the center of this. What might we learn from this case in terms of the sort of twin project that the Modi regime seems to embody, the sort of, this very aggressive push to neoliberalize and kind of produce quote unquote economic development outcomes at the expense of poor marginalized people on the one hand. And secondly, this very unique project that the Modi regime is tied to, which is Hindutva, and this idea of kind of really building a Hindu supremacist state on the rubble of what remains of the Indian kind of on the democratic project that is India. Could you speak to that, Dr. Crandall? Is your mic back on?
Is it working now?
Oh, it's working perfectly. So I just suggested we move to the earlier question, which we had decided to postpone. But since you're back, maybe is that okay, panelists? Is that fine? Okay, Dr. Crandall, the question for you. I don't. You heard the question, so if you want to take it, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and thank you for the wonderful introduction. And basically, the report, I'd say it's a smoking gun that shows that clearly the evidence was.
We have definitely moved to the age of digitized books.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, so I mean, it definitely shows that the evidence was planted on the hard drive. So specifically 10 documents that were cited as evidence. And I can go through a bit about why, I would characterize it as a smoking gun, and then what it means that you have to look a little deeper to see it. So it's not like it's, the smoking gun is hidden or anything. You just have to look a little bit deeper. Like it just challenges you to do a better job of digital forensics to see what's there. And but you can clearly see that the documents were planted on Rona Wilson's laptop, because what happens with any kind of modern operating system like Windows or Macintosh is that there are different ways for people to, command the system, and those would be called a shell. And the shell that most people are used to is the keyboard and the mouse and the screen. So most people, when they interact with their laptop, they open their laptop and then they're typing what they want their computer to do, and they're using the mouse to click. I want to run this program, so I double click on it. And then they're seeing what's happening on the screen. So that's one shell, and that's the most common shell that everybody knows. And there are other types of shells. Another type of shell is what's called a remote access Trojan, which almost exclusively is used by malware to control people's computers remotely. And so this would be an infection that you got on your computer, and the commands would come over the network, and they would, each of these shells is a process. So machines have different processes in them. If you've ever had to open the task manager, you've seen the different processes running. And so a process would be running that was a malicious process that takes commands coming over the network through what's called a network socket. And then the results of those commands, things are changing on your system, so they can control the files and everything on your system just like you can through your normal shell. But this remote access Trojan, it also will send feedback and the results of the commands and everything out through the same network socket back to whoever's controlling the computer remotely. And those two shells can be happening at the same time. So you could be logged into your laptop and you're typing commands and you're clicking on things that you want to do, and then somebody is remotely running a shell, a remote access Trojan through, it's also running on your machine, and they're also editing files and doing things on your machine. And what happens is that if you look as deep as you should, if you do due diligence in terms of a digital investigation of Rona Wilson's laptop, then there's a very clear what's called a process tree. So process tree is, what did processes on the system do? Like, what other processes did they create? What files did they interact with and everything? And it forms a tree, kind of like a family tree. If you want to put a document on the system, you'll fork what's called a child process, and your child process will actually create the document and then return control back to you. And so that process tree will show exactly who was it, who put the document on the system. Was it the remote access Trojan? Was it that shell, or was it the person sitting at the laptop using the keyboard and mouse? And through putting the pieces together of the process tree going back 2 years, which is a challenging thing to do, but it's possible, and Arsenal Computing puts out tools to help you do that, you can clearly see these two shells doing things on the system. And one of those shells is the remote access Trojan, and you can clearly see that it's the remote access Trojan putting those documents, pulling them down off the network, and then decompressing them and putting them on the hard drive. And you can see the commands as they move them around the hard drive and everything. So it's not something that if you just go, buy, I want a digital investigation toolkit. You can, for $5,000, you can, if you're a law enforcement agency, you can buy something that you just plug a laptop into. You take out the hard drive, plug it in, and it'll tell you, well, here's all the evidence that's on here. It's not something that you'll see with that, but if you do due diligence and you look a little bit deeper, like Arsenal did, it's very clear what happened, and it's really not disputable in my opinion, because computers keep very clear records of things, and those records clearly show who put the documents on the laptop. And that's pretty much the digital evidence in a nutshell. I don't know if people have other specific questions about it. But.
Thank you so much, Dr. Crandall, for breaking it down for us. I was struck by the remote access Trojan. It spells rat, and it does sound
Yeah.
appropriate. But uh, I had another question. I mean, oftentimes we hear about this a lot, right? I mean, because we use the internet now. There's an insane amount of internet usage now, given that we have Wi-Fi and multiple devices, and constantly getting reminders about emails and texts, and things happening all the time. We hear a lot about hacking. We hear a lot about spam. We hear a lot about malware. We hear a lot about things crashing, or suspicions of snooping, etc., etc. So in some ways, this is part of our kind of common sensibility around the uses of digital technology today, that there is always bound to be some kind of bad stuff happening as well, right? So of course the immediate reaction we have is that, well, what can we do to protect ourselves? And of course we're told we should use antivirus, or we should avoid certain websites, or we should be careful how we keep our passwords, or what passwords we choose, etc., etc., etc. I just have a very simple question, because there is so much kind of a cloud of confusion around all of this, that it might be easy to think that what had happened to Ronald Wilson's computer was simply a matter of hacking, as in somebody just you know did this because it's commonly available, you know, commonly available tools can be easily put into play here. But I think the Arsenal report is showing us that this is something much bigger than simply a small case of some teenager in a basement kind of hacking into somebody's computer, right? So could you kind of break that down for us a little bit, just so we can get past that misconception that this is just another case of hacking?
Yeah, I think the key word here is persistence. So when people talk about APT malware, which the implication of APT malware is usually that it's a state actor, or a drug cartel, somebody that's very well resourced that's behind it. And in this case, persistence is the really key word, because it wasn't technically sophisticated in the sense of something the regular hackers wouldn't be able to do. The way that the rat got into Ronald Wilson's system is also in the Arsenal report. And it was an email that appeared to come from a friend and had an attachment. And he clicked on that attachment to that email. And then that's how the rat originally got into his laptop. And then the rat itself is available. Anybody can go download it and then compile it with their specific needs and use it. But what was remarkable is the persistence, because a lot of people don't realize, I mean, you see how hard it is to keep software running on your system. There's bugs and there's, security problems and everything. It's really, really hard to keep software running on somebody else's computer when you're not supposed to be there. And they're running updates when you're not expecting and everything. So it takes a lot of persistence from the beginning all the way till the for 2 years, you can see a lot of persistence on whoever carried out this attack. So the first thing that mirrors what we've seen with like the Tibetan exile community, for example, in northern India, they've seen a lot of this kind of social engineering, where they will know specifically, like, you talked to this friend about this document yesterday, because they've been gathering intelligence through other means. And so they'll send an email from that friend saying, like, here's that specific attachment. And you'll see a high degree of social engineering. So even though the technical sophistication isn't there, the intelligence that goes behind it, and then the sophistication of the social engineering, that's something that you see in this case too, on Rona Wilson's laptop in Rona Wilson's case. And then just to keep something going on somebody else's laptop, or under the conditions of you're not in physical control of the machine, you don't control the software on it or anything, and it takes a very persistent and well-resourced attacker to carry that out for two years, which is what happened in Ron Wilson's case. So that persistence is not characteristic of a typical attacker.
Thank you, Dr. Crandall, for illuminating that particular facet of this case. A very important one, especially because one of the kind of immediate responses that a lot of folks kind of come up with this. Yeah, what's new? I mean, hacking happens all the time, right? But this is, I think, is really important. I think 2 points. I think what you raised are really critical here, which is persistence, and and I would also imagine that this persistence would require substantial resources. That
Yeah.
some teenager in a basement will not be able to do this sort of stuff. But thank you so much for that. I want to go back to the question that we earlier almost kind of started, but can our panelists kind of speak to this issue of this sort of twin project neoliberalization that is happening and that is being resisted vigorously across the country in very different contexts. Huge mobilizations are happening, but it's being pushed with a tremendous amount of violence, and opponents to this are being labeled increasingly as sort of threats and dangers, etc., etc. But simultaneously, this project of Hindutva, and perhaps you could shed a little light on this for our audience members who might not be very familiar with Hindutva and Narendra Modi's role and his sort of place within the Hindutva project, both neoliberalism and Hindutva. There's a lot, but if you can kind of try to break down these for us, that would be great. Thanks.
Sure. Let me just say something about Hindutva, and I think Aparna would be saying something about neoliberalism, right? Okay. But before I get into it, I just wanted to add a couple more things to what Jed beautifully captured. I think we need to understand that the entire case against the BK16 is resting on showing this kind of a link between all of them and the Maoists. That is, that the BK16 is supposedly, purportedly, allegedly working at the behest of or on behalf of the Maoists. And that case then itself comes down to just maybe, I don't know the exact number, but it's no more than a couple dozen digital documents that purportedly exist on 2 of the 16 folks' computers, Rona Wilson and Surinder Gardling, and that these docs, these digital documents supposedly show something. And I just wanted to give one example. These documents are very simple, and sometimes all they do is they just mention someone by the name of Comrade Anand. So, for example, one of the key people who are in jail is known as Anand Tentumde. Dr. Anand Tentumde is one of India's most well-known, nationally and internationally known public intellectuals. And Anand is also a very common name, almost as common as John, probably something like that. And so there's some mention of somebody writing something, oh, thank you, Comrade Anand. And that immediately gets picked up by the state machinery and the media that is also well within the grasp of the state, and so much so that now using the word comrade in India is itself, it has struck a chord of fear. And it's also showing how unrealistic these so-called documents are, all of which have been in some way identified by Arsenal as being put out by rats, right? And it's also unrealistic because it has been pointed out time and again that Maoists do not write long essays, and they also use aliases. And many of India's leading organizations that are working on forensic have long ago pointed out that this is a very dubious set of data, and Arsenal now has just shown it through the dint of whatever hard work and actually put it out there. So I just wanted to lay it out there. But to get back to Hindutva, clamping down of any kind of dissent and a culture of fear and anti-intellectualism, even an anti-liberalism, and in India, to the extent liberalism exists, it is enshrined in the constitution. That's it. And also the utter vacuity of an ultra-nationalist populism that needs enemies constantly. Enemies are constantly being created. Now, this is all what we now understand as the work of something called Hindutva. And I just want to make a few very brief points about what is Hindutva then. We know, for example, that India has long been a violent society, but something new has happened with the everyday as well as institutional forms of violence that are on display in very egregious ways. And it may also be, so I wanted to also say that this rise of Hindutva is also part of a larger worldwide rise of states of terror, cultures of hate, and authoritarian populism, ultranationalism, and also backed up by charismatic demagogic leadership. And a leading historian, for example, at Stanford, Thomas Blom Hansen, in his very latest book, calls India a democracy without democratic values, which may actually be too generous. Some kind of a way in which, but he also says that India, the current regime, is one of low intensity terror. And so Hindutva then it references a Hindu supremacist movement that has been in formation at least for a century, slightly more, and whose project is to make India into a Hindu Rashtra, which translates directly to a Hindu nation. That is a nation of, by, and for Hindus. And the term Hindu itself is a contested term. Who are Hindus is not an easy thing to determine, but Hindutva has over the last century developed a very well-honed ideology that enables particular identities and actions. So it's not just an ideology up in the air, but it actually mobilizes people to act in very particular ways. And it has also systematized and coordinated those actions. So it is a well-developed organization. So it's an ideology as well as an organization. And not surprisingly, some of the key features might be almost resonating with, for example, white supremacist organizations here. But remember, this is a 100-year-old, really well-honed in, well-heeled, and very well endowed in terms of financial resources organization. And this then has some way in which it has put forward a certain set of ideas that, for example, people only exist as members of demarcated or fixed groups, which could be racial groups, religious groups, or even castes, and that Hindus are one of these demarcated groups, but they're superior to all others, at least in India, and that India itself is a territory that belongs properly to Hindus, so there's a territorial claim, and also that Hindus have been victimized and that they're in decline, so this kind of a victimhood gets played out, and that outsiders are all the others who are not Hindus, and they are problems to be resolved. And this organization and movement draws almost direct inspiration in the 1930s with visits by key ideologues to Mussolini's Balilla and avant-gardist youth organizations. And this is a set of organizations now who are more or less, they have a stranglehold institutionally over the media, over the economy. They dominate over all political parties, and they're culturally the most sophisticated and have been doing it for a very long time. So they're in every pore of Indian society and polity and in charge of the state, at least since 2014. They have been in charge of the state. In one earlier stint, it didn't produce this kind of a institutional capture, but since 2014, there has been that kind of an institutional capture. I'll probably stop there. We could talk endlessly about this, but I just hope that I've made some very simple and clear points that this is an extraordinarily fearful time in Indian history.
Thank you, Dr. Natarajan, for that. And yes, indeed, we need all the insights we can get on this incredibly important issue. Dr. Sundar, do you want to take this on further?
Yeah, I'll just pick up from where Dr. Natarajan ended in talking about the sort of the twin project of neoliberalization. And I think some of the things that he pointed out with respect to Hindutva are worth reiterating. First of all, that Hindutva is sort of part of, as he said, a kind of global move towards authoritarian populisms. And that global move has been linked everywhere to growing neoliberalization as well. So there is a kind of that same kind of twin move whereby on the one hand, a real sort of attack on the state and state institutions that are welfarist and protectionist in favor of the market, and at the same time, a really strong reassertion of the state in the sense of nationalism, nationalist assertion, and the security state, right? So sort of trying to whittle away at state ownership and state control of the public sphere, of the public sector and public good, and at the same time, strengthening the kind of language of statism and national statism. So that's one thing that's been happening. What Hindutva and neoliberalism do together is also that claims that were being made and really should be made in the language of class around resources, displacement, dispossession, which is what is happening so rampantly and so extensively across India, are now constantly being redefined and renamed as claims around identity, right? So that whereas people are being displaced as Adivasi inhabitants of rich forest land, they're now being forced constantly also to define themselves as Hindu or non-Hindu, as part of this Hindu majority or non-Hindu majority. So it has a way of displacing struggles around or resistance to neoliberal displacement in the language of identity and Hindu or caste identity. So they're kind of functional to each other in some sense, these twin projects, so they reinforce each other. Specifically around the neoliberalization project of the Modi government. Of course, they're not the first government to introduce that in the Indian case. The project of neoliberalism and opening up to the market of privatization has been ongoing since the 1990s. But since the BJP government came to power in 2014, there's been a real kind of deepening of this in the form of increased selling off of public sector assets, and also really strong attacks on labor legislation, as well as you mentioned, Dr. Swami, when you started off, on farm agricultural protection and so on. So especially one of the things that the government did during the whole COVID period last year, when people were demobilized, isolated, under lockdown, etc., was to try and ram through both legislation, removing the very limited labor legislation that India already had in terms of wages, working hours, and so on, and as well deregulating the agricultural market, which has sparked these massive farm protests, right? So both of these are evidence of how sort of fast this government is wanting to move in completely destroying any kinds of protections that exist around to protect sort of ordinary people, farmers, workers, and so on. And one of the key areas that has become a sort of major site for contestation here is around land and mineral resources, right? So starting early in the 2000s, but really intensifying in the last 10 years or so, are attempts to acquire land acquisition law to make possible land acquisition for industrialization and especially for mining. And the Central Indian Tract, which is heavily forested, is also really rich in mineral resources. And it's also where a huge section of the population, or where a significant portion of India's indigenous people are based. So they've become kind of the targets of much of this land acquisition push of the government for industrialization and for mining development. And so their resistance has become especially a thorn in the side of the government's attempts to acquire land, and has become very important to delegitimize that resistance from them. And so, various kinds of laws, there had been laws that had constitutional amendments that had actually attempted to provide protection and extend indigenous law over territories that they lived in, as well as rights to forest rights acts that had been, Forest Right Act had been passed in 2006. And since the Modi government came to power, there have been attempts to undermine that, to do away with that. And all of that has been resisted very strongly by the indigenous Adivasi communities, and of course by all those who defend them. So part of what we can see with the BK case is really that you can see vividly the particular communities that are resisting the land grabs, that are resisting the displacement, the people who are acting to defend them, such as Father Stan Swami, or Sudha Bhardwaj, or Mahesh Raut. All of these people who are active, working with indigenous communities, are amongst those who've been targeted and hauled up and arrested in this case. So really a very close relationship between the government's kind of neoliberalization projects to acquire land, to acquire forest resources, and then the particular people that it's targeting. The other thing that's worth mentioning about the way neoliberalization, of course, plays out everywhere in India as elsewhere is that it is a class project. It is about shoring up and reinforcing the power of those who own capital and those who have control resources. And what we've seen in India over the last several decades has been a real widening of inequality, right? So even in the pandemic period, we had more billionaires being created and more wealth being controlled, and especially by 2 or 3 families that have become extremely powerful and that are also extremely close to the current BJP government, the Adani Group, the Ambani Group, which are big conglomerates, which have become whose wealth has grown in the last year, even as unemployment and poverty have reached the kinds of levels that we haven't seen in the last 4 decades, right? So the gap has grown exponentially. And in a sense, Hindutva is a caste project about reinforcing the caste, the caste hierarchy and shoring up the power, the sort of authority and status of the upper caste. And so in some ways, again, the two go very well hand in hand because they really are about reinforcing the caste class dominance of certain groups within Indian society. And that is part of the project of this government. And then finally, to just pick up on a point that Dr. Natarajan also made, which is about the Indian Constitution and the fact that the Constitution is truly an important document, because it guarantees certain kinds of liberal freedoms and civil liberties and protections, all of which this case is really an instance of the contravention of all of those, the rights to freedom of expression, dissent, fair trial, etc. But the Constitution is also very important because of the ways in which the right to life, its Article 21 was expanded to include the right to livelihood. It was expanded to include the right to land and resources under something like the protection of, the PESA Act, which protected indigenous communities in certain ways. And so all of those are also being defended through the kinds of struggles that these Bhima Koregaon human rights defenders have supported. So again, Father Stan's defense of indigenous people who are involved in a movement called the Pathalgadi movement, which was really about enshrining the constitutional provision for indigenous people on kind of pillars, rock pillars outside their village. They were reaffirmations of the Constitution and its defense of rights and liberties and livelihoods. And these were the very people who were then dubbed seditious and anti-national and arrested. So you can really see the close relationship between that kind of neoliberal desire to acquire these lands and the particular kinds of people that are being targeted by cases like this.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Sundar. I think that really opened up a lot, and it's quite the understanding that seems to. I mean, at least in one way, it appears now that the very people who are defending and invoking the Constitution and rights and democracy are being targeted by a regime that claims to be sort of legitimate because it came to power through a democracy. And it's a very ironic reversal, and I think it's recognizable in other political contexts as well, as we see what has been happening in the United States as well, in the advanced democracies. two things that really struck me in your formulation here, Dr. Sundar, the sort of the linking of neoliberalization, or kind of the framing of neoliberalization as essentially a class project, right? And here I think this also ties into a kind of a broader set of issues around the so-called middle class, and the sort of this middle that much of neoliberal India seems to be catering to or speaking on behalf of. And the second formulation I also found very interesting and provocative, and perhaps something that might benefit from further analysis for those of us more and less familiar with these issues. That Hindutva is a caste project, as in Hindutva has, there's something deeply intrinsically kind of Brahminical about this project as well. If either you or Dr. Natarajan would like to kind of say a few words on that, sort of the caste project side of things, because what is striking here is that all of the people who are being targeted here tend to be either Dalits or Adivasis or members of lower oppressed caste groups, and all of the people associated with the beneficiaries of the Modi regime tend to be Brahmins or upper caste people, or merchant, various kinds of, trader groups, etc. And there seems to be a kind of an unspoken caste war that is also playing out in all of this. Maybe if you can say something about that, then we can move on to the next question.
Dr. Sundar, do you want me to take it? All right. So let me just say, and this builds out of what Dr. Sundar said. I think Hindutva is also a militaristic masculinist project. So if we enter it from there, it cannot not be a casteist project. However, I would want to qualify that by saying it's actually a neo-Brahminical project, in the sense that it's not just something that is just reproducing something from India's ancient Brahminism. It is extremely adept and flexible in a way that it actually co-opts all kinds of people. There are people from the dominant caste. Sudha Bharadwaj, for example, is one of them, who is in prison, and she's part of the BK 16. There are others too. Nonetheless, it is predominantly a oppressed caste, mostly Dalits, who are also in prison. But there are several others outside of the BK 16 who are also languishing in prison, and they could be of just about any caste. The point is, anyone who opposes Hindutva, anyone who's a vocal critic of Hindutva, anyone who's also a vocal critic then of Hindutva's counter-revolutionary capitalist projects. This is Arthur Rosenberg, the student of fascism's term. And that's what Hindutva is. It's a counter-revolutionary capitalist project. And it is a crony capitalist, a big capital, all kinds of things that Dr. Sundar has described. But in the midst of that, it combines caste and class in very interesting and complex ways. There are, for example, Dalits who support the BJP regime and Hindutva, and that befuddles a lot of us. And that's precisely because we fail to understand the complex ways in which Hindutva politics works on the ground. There are all kinds of things that are done, not just to fool people, because people are not foolish, at least not foolish all the time. And so we have to have some way of complicating our own analysis of, yes, Hindutva is a casteist project, but what does that mean? And caste and class are imbricated in very, very interesting ways that we can see in terms of the ownership of wealth and resources, but also on the two other axes of power, who is part of the sharing of power, and also that the dominant caste themselves are not just Brahmins. So idea of status being a linear thing is itself not that easily borne out in empirical terms. Most of India's owners of capital in urban capital happen to be non-Brahmin dominant castes. And a good number of the land-owning castes in rural India today might even be intermediate castes. Definitely, one thing is clear that Dalits, Adivasis, and Muslims are completely written out of that equation, and the three of them put together form almost half of India. So I just wanted to add some of that there.
That really helped. I mean, I think it kind of really makes the issue far more complicated than simply the sort of linear formulations we might have. And oftentimes, I think caste is a very complicated issue for folks from outside India to actually grapple with. And I would actually argue many of us from India also take lifetimes to kind of really understand, especially because we are also kind of embedded within these spaces from more often than not. And those of us in the diaspora tend to be from fairly privileged backgrounds, and we're beginning to kind of see all of this in much more visceral terms now, I think, given what is happening. We have a question in the Q&A, but before we go there, I have one question. I want to get back to you, Dr. Crandall. So this has to do with the sort of the nature of the evidence and sort of the way in which this particular report and its findings might perhaps, just your thoughts on how might this perhaps have some implications for evidentiary standards. So, I mean, given that this stuff is all fairly new, right? I mean, it's becoming a part of our landscape and our ways of life right now, more and more. And some of this stuff has been kind of taken for granted. But now, given the kind of, what you've laid out, these very, very kind of invisible ways through which power can kind of, manipulate these technologies, right? What might this hold? I mean, do you see any particular implications for, other cases, similar cases, since you're familiar with many of these issues beyond the Indian context? Would there be any kind of implications that this particular report's findings might have for how we treat evidence and think about digital evidence?
Yeah, I think two ideas come to mind. So one is, and Mark Spencer, the author of the Arsenal report, will say the same thing, is that even though Arsenal has, they're leaders in looking a little bit deeper into the digital evidence that's there, it really should be the standard, not like Arsenal is special. But you should look at all the evidence. If you take a hard drive and that hard drive is a 1 terabyte hard drive, you should look at all of the 1 terabyte of bits that are there, because what happens is that as you're using the system, for technical reasons that I won't get into, but it's called virtualization, because everything is virtualized in a system. Whatever you're doing, a lot of copies get made of it, and then it gets put all over the place. So there's just copies of random stuff all over the place. So if you want to see what happened 2 years ago, even if those records have been deleted, copies of them might have been left in random places on the hard drive where you can still find them. And that's what Arsenal does a great job of, and that's what everybody should be doing, especially if you're going to, charge somebody with a very, very serious crime and keep them in prison for 2 years without bail. That should be the standard. That shouldn't be like Arsenal is a special, very capable, who you go hire when you need that level of care for the evidence. That should be the standard that should, be required to keep someone in jail like that. And so that's one thought that comes to mind. And then another thought, just thinking more broadly, because we've studied a lot of different kinds of information controls over time. So there's, internet censorship. People put boxes in the network so that you can't access certain websites, or they'll look for certain keywords and they'll block those. And then we've seen malware campaigns, typically to steal documents, but more recently with the Rona Wilson case, we see that they can also plant documents. And you see, social media, you see bullying campaigns in social media where they'll harass somebody in social media. There's a whole wide range of apparatus that, the people that want to exert that kind of control will do. Typically the people in power, typically state actors like governments. But what it boils down to is that they're usually after people that have a large sphere of influence, that they're making their own independent sphere of influence. So people, when they think about internet censorship, they usually think, well, they don't want me to see this on the internet, or they don't want me to say this on the internet. And they see the keywords, or they see the websites that are blocked. Or you see, different things that happen within information controls, but it almost always boils down to they're targeting a specific person with a sphere of influence, and then they're trying to take away that sphere of influence. So that could mean because you can't go to their website, or because you can't use the keywords that would help you find their website, or it could be they're spying on that person, trying to get intelligence about them, or in the case of what we've seen with the BK12 and Ron Wilson, even planting evidence to accuse them of a crime. So it's just something that I thought about, because all three of you mentioned that the BK16 are people that had a broad sphere of influence, and they're very important people on the scene. So that was something that struck me.
Thanks, Dr. Crandall. That very sobering, but it's also useful to know that, what you're calling for is like to raise the bar for evidentiary, processes, investigations, etc. And that's I think if I'm hearing you right, this would actually be extremely influential in terms of kind of enabling us to see, as you put it, like a drive not just as a store of data that is immediately available and visible, but also a drive as a store of data that might have been accumulated over a long period of time and stored in different parts, should require a much more comprehensive set of approaches. And that is very, very useful. Thank you. We have a one question that is broadly, I'm going to lay this out for, present this to all three of you, and you share your thoughts on this. And this has to do with something I was thinking about in terms of what, there's a lot of talk about fake news out there. And I was wondering if you might have some thoughts on this. What I would kind of roughly call the sociology of fake evidence as revealed in this case. Would it be fair to say that if fake news requires a sort of discursive ecosystem to thrive, with closed and expansive networks where shared misinformation gets amplified, can we think of fake evidence as also requiring something similar or analogous? Like, for instance, the role played by the media in whipping up the hysteria over urban Naxals and so on, anti-nationalism, so on and so forth. In short, how do blatant falsehoods perpetrated by Indian state become acceptable? How does the state's hand, even when it is exposed, or despite the state's hand being exposed, how is it that public apathy continues to be a challenge? And many of the accused, most of the accused, all of them in fact, save for one individual, Varora Rao, remain incarcerated. There is something about kind of this is pretty explosive report. This report shattered the government's case. But months later, we're still seeing how there is a sort of almost apathy towards all of this. And I'm wondering if you all had some thoughts on how fake evidence works with a kind of a friendly ecosystem that permits it to actually do a lot of the damage that it is doing, regardless of or despite efforts to expose it and make it available for public knowledge. And please feel free to share this question amongst yourselves.
So I'm happy to start if that's okay. So I think you already alluded to some of this yourself, Dr. Swami, when you talked about the role of the media. And if you see how this particular case unfolded, one of the first things that the police did soon after they made the first set of arrests in June of 2018 was that they produced, they did a press conference and they produced these 10 letters, and sort of waved them to the media and read out these juicy bits that you yourself quoted about, so-and-so, or maybe Dr. Natarajan, then comrade this, and can you supply X number of guns? And, so sort of all of this stuff And then the media really ran with it, right? And so one has to think about the ecosystem of the media in India today, which is really, really important to understanding how the case is playing out, which is that much of the mainstream media, both print and television, and especially television, is really kind of captive to the government. In fact, the term that's used in India commonly to describe this media is Godi media or lapdog media. So it doesn't ever, it's subservient to the government, either because it needs the huge amount of government advertising that the government gives, or because they threaten them with various kinds of tax enforcement raids, or because of their own, or because they're owned by companies close to the government. So a variety of reasons, these big mainstream media companies have become entirely subservient to the government's goals. And so the way they operate is, when a story like this is given to them, they hype it up and they make it a big, they start using all of these terms that you described, the urban Naxals, which is, the urban academic scholarly media supporters in the cities of the Maoists, so-called supporters of the Maoists in the cities. They've done this for all kinds of things. Even things like the Tablighi Jamaat, a Muslim sect that met in Delhi and just before the pandemic lockdown, was supposed to have spread COVID because they had this huge meeting. The media ran with it, and then they make a big noise about it. Later on, the courts, arrested some of these Tablighis, then discharged them, so there was no case against them. But then we never heard anything about it later. And partly this is what it will do now. When it talked so much about the press conference, but we've heard so little in the mainstream media about this report. It's been left really to the Washington Post and to some of the smaller, feisty digital media in India. We've had some good coverage in TV, like the NDTV, but by and large, it's not been, the arsenic report has not been exposed to the extent that the early letters were in the media, right? And the government too responds very cleverly in that anything like this that's an expose just meets with silence. And so then it just kind of dies away because the media is not picking it up, the government's not providing any response. And so, how do you actually have it circulate and make noise and have the kind of effect? And then just one last thing before I let the others speak is, I think also the way the UAPA works and the way these charges work, they're so extreme. They, by using terms like anti-national, Maoist, seditious, making all of these extreme kinds of charges, people are left not knowing what to believe and what not to believe. You really vilify people when you arrest them under these charges. And so, then you hear that the evidence was planted, but you're like, well, yeah, but what was planted, what was not. I mean, there's a sort of state of confusion that's sown, partly by the extreme nature of the charges that are leveled and the kind of hype that's generated around them. And so that's part of the ecosystem that then allows even this kind of damning evidence to go without having the effect it should.
Thank you, Dr.
Sundar. I just wanted to pick off where Dr. Sundar was leading us. And yes, fake news is based on fake evidence. The two things are related. Both of them require a technology to transmit and communicate. And so it is like a virus. And so we need, almost an epidemiological approach to study these types of phenomena. And what is as frightening as the growth of stormtrooper events that have taken charge of much of popular culture in India, where you have armed militia of some kind or another, going and terrorizing people. But what is as fearful, I think, to see is a transfixed set of people, almost a mob mentality, cheering and jeering, and even videographing, and then the videos become viral, and the humble act of forwarding it through WhatsApp. So much so that India is probably the most important site on the new legal issues that we are hearing from Facebook and WhatsApp for fake news and transmission, because in India, that actually ends up killing people and lynching people in public and celebrating that lynching, including the celebration of rapes. To my mind, the baying for blood and the bystander effect that Norman Garris and a lot of folks who've looked at the Holocaust, for example, think about, that is very much in play, and that points to an incredible erosion of a scientific culture, scientific temper that did exist and still does exist in different parts of India, especially in some intentionally produced rationalist cultures in India. And that I think I just wanted to add something to Professor Swami's title. It's definitely hacking away at democracy, but there is a word that is overplayed and celebrated in India, and that is called jugaad. And jugaad culture is almost like the positive part is it's a very innovative thing that people can just fix things with very little resources, and that can be celebrated. But the other side of it is a hack. It is a hacking culture. And so what is being hacked is actually truth. What is being hacked is the ability to discern right from wrong, the ability to discern fact from fiction. And Hindutva is heavily based on this, because for them, myth is history. And they are stalwarts, unparalleled today in terms of power in putting forth myth as history. They love technology, they worship technology, but they hate science. So, for example, they love the fact that nuclear technology gives them geopolitical power, or communication technologies that they control give them that type of a power to mobilize people, but they are very much anti-science. And so this is a hacking away of truth as well as democracy.
Thank you. Dr. Crandall, did you want to add anything to that?
I don't have much to add. I just want to just briefly say that some of the responses that have come out to the Arsenal report, just speaking to the idea of science and that something is either true or not. I mean, some of them are absurd. That somehow somebody modified the hard drive image before Arsenal saw it. And there's a very well standardized, everybody in digital investigation knows it. There's a cryptographic checksum, and you can very quickly check, was it modified or not? And that's an example of something that, it's a very binary thing. You can check, did it happen or not? And it clearly didn't happen, but still people can put it out there. And I think there's definitely a lot of that surrounding this case too. So.
No, thank you for bringing that up, because that is, I think, a really important issue. A lot of I guess, skepticism about the report that is expressed, publicly by folks who are hearing about this, centers on this idea that, well, I mean, how do they know this is true? I mean, maybe it was manipulated by somebody else to make it look like the government did something bad, right? And this is, of course, I think in anthropology, Dr. Natarajan would recognize this sort of secondary elaboration, process, right? If something doesn't pan out, you find some way to explain why, there was some kind of manipulation at work. But that's really important that you bring up the checksum issue. Could you say a little bit about that checksum, because I think it's something that affects, I think we can all kind of easily grasp if we only kind of understood it a little clearer.
Yeah, so there's a couple of layers of complexity to it. So if you take a secure cryptographic checksum, then what it is it's a digest of a larger image. So if you have a terabyte hard drive, you don't want somebody to have to sit there with their eyeball and look at all the ones and zeros of an entire terabyte and say, yeah, none of these changed. So in cryptography, they, many years ago developed something called a cryptographic checksum, which summarizes a larger image with a smaller number. It's also just a binary image, a bunch of bits. And it's typically like 512 bits long. So you can sit there and for 512 bits, you can say, well, none of these bits changed. And the cryptography that goes behind it makes it so that nobody, with any practical sense, somebody, unless they can crack the best cryptography of today, which as far as we know, nobody can, nobody could change the original image without also changing a bit in the cryptographic checksum. And so that is a standard of evidence that, around the world, whenever somebody takes an image of a hard drive, they create a cryptographic checksum. And then anybody else, the defense gets a copy of the image, and, third-party consultants can get a copy of the image, and it's always accompanied by that checksum to make sure it hasn't changed. And something, just because it might come up, I don't know if it has, but MD5, the specific checksum that is used around the world for digital investigation like this, has a flaw, but that flaw is not really applicable to the case of digital investigation. Like I could make 2 hard drive images and I could have them have the same MD5 sum, because MD5 as a cryptographic checksum is flawed. But it would be impossible, and it was the Pune police who took the image and created the checksum. Even with MD5, even though it has flaws, it's still impossible for somebody to change the image without changing the checksum, because that's not the way the MD5 is broken. MD5 is broken in a different way that only comes up in other contexts. So.
Thank you, Dr. Crandall. That makes a lot of sense. So the image has the way to verify that the image has not been changed and manipulated is to ensure that the checksum matches. The checksum that's on the receiving end. Okay, excellent, and that really helps a lot. Thank you, and sorry for these questions. These might sound very kind of but I just wanted to I know we are out of time, but I just wanted to see if our panelists would take this question that we have from one of our participants here. Dr. Natarajan already responded to it in text, but I'll just go ahead and read it just in case the other panelists would also be interested in responding to it. This is from one of our colleagues here, the Department of Anthropology, Dr. Tamar Shirinian, who says, thank you for all the insight you've provided in this case and the larger context. My question is about the present and the future. What kinds of futures do you see in pushing this case in the courts? Is this case being used for liberating those falsely charged, or is it also being used to push charges against the state? Do you see the possibilities of this making strides against the BJP government? And what role does this particular evidence play in public persuasion or quote unquote changing hearts and minds? Does this matter? Questions open for all of you.
Since I've already responded, I'll, of course, yield to Dr. Sundar or Dr. Crandall.
Well, my response would be, I think all of these, all of the above, in the sense that it's a very important report to try for getting those who are arrested under false charges released. And I think it's a test case, really, because if this kind of evidence can be used, fake evidence can be planted and used to incarcerate people, then of course we're going into the dark ages, really, because then this can be planted all over the place and all kinds of people can be arrested. So it's a really important case, and the fact that it's not being given its due importance by the Indian media, the government hasn't responded to it. It's shocking. I mean, who has planted this evidence? Who had the time and energy and resources for 2 years to persistently plant this evidence? And if we need some answers. If if it's not those who are trying to incriminate these, the government itself who's trying to incriminate these people or under these, then who is it? The government should investigate. Tell us who it is, right? It's an absolutely important case in just for the rule of law, you know, for civil liberties in India. It's a very important case. And I think changing hearts and minds, well, I think, you know, people have to really ask some questions about what does it mean when we have a government in place that is willing to rely on this kind of evidence and go to this kind of lengths to incarcerate people, really, really excellent human beings who've, you know, dedicated their lives to fighting important kinds of struggles in defense of human rights. So I think even just in terms of thinking about who are the kinds of people who are being held, this is a very important case. You know, why are these people being held? Who are they? And what do they represent? And so it's also important to take this case up because of the particular kinds of issues that those incarcerated in Bhima Koregaon represent. But then, you know, like I said at the beginning, the numbers of those arrested under UAPA is just growing. It's being used against all kinds of people. It's being used to arrest, you know, some student who maybe protested during the Anti-Citizenship Act protest, you know, very ordinary people, sometimes out for the first time in their lives to protest in a public space and now being arrested under UAPA. So it's a test case for the law as well, and just how easily this UAPA law is being used to silence people and to suppress dissent and to really create an atmosphere of fear within the country. So I think it's a very important case, and even if it's just about fighting this case without, you know, larger issues about whether it's trying to displace the government or not, it's a very important case to fight, and the report is really strong evidence that this is a fake case.
And I'll just quickly say, in terms of the technical aspect of the ability to put documents on somebody else's machine, everybody just assumes that's possible. It's pretty easy to do with the remote access Trojan, but you know, I've been working with the Citizen Lab for a long time, and they're experts in all of these malware campaigns. And they've tracked a lot of different campaigns in a lot of different countries and seen, you know, the spying and the different things that governments do when they put remote access Trojans on, you know, user devices. But I can only think of two cases where, you know, very clearly evidence was planted and the actors got caught doing that. And this is one of them. And then the other was another report that Arsenal Computing did in Turkey that was already mentioned. And those are the only two concrete cases that I can point to where you can see, you know, the technical evidence that happened. So that makes it important too.
I would just like to add a couple more points. One is that there is an international aspect to this. So, and that comes in two ways. One is, for example, the thing that was just mentioned by Dr. Crandall. Recently, there was a malware called the Pegasus software, and several people in India who are prominent as well as not so prominent activists ended up being caught in that web, and that had something to do with things outside of India, including a nexus that is formed technologically, militarily, as well as in intelligence ways, espionage, which goes even through Israel, for example. So that's one end of the international angle. And the second one is that because of the shrinking space of civil liberties and human rights and things like that in India, there is an increasing need to think about how pressures from outside India can be brought to bear. And that itself is a very huge task, and we don't know how effective that would be. But very recently, just to give an example to what Dr. Sundar was mentioning, that a very wide range of people are being targeted under the UAPA. I don't know the exact title for John Kerry, but he's something in this administration, some executive position, and he recently just made a statement about a young student called Divya in India who at some protest probably said something positive about Greta Thunberg on an environmentalist thing, and promptly she was booked. And yeah, Disha Ravi, that's right. And so John Kerry gave something positive about Miss Disha. And I mean, these are just small ways that pressures could be put. I don't know eventually how it would actually make a government that is shameless actually feel shameful. And one last point, Dr. Swami, yes, secondary elaboration, which was put forth in some interesting ways using psychoanalysis and all by Evans Pritchard, nonetheless, right? I mean, nothing less than Evans Pritchard, but he was talking about witchcraft, and I think we are engaging with some witchcraft here from Hindutva. So we need to have our anthropological lens really sharpened. How do we tackle witchcraft?
or witch hunts as
Yeah,
That's
that's
right.
what I was going to say. How do we also resist witch?
That's right. That's right. Very good. Yes.
But thank you all so much, Dr. Sundar, Dr. Natarajan, Dr. Crandall. Thank you for this really rich conversation. I am sure all of the participants and audience members here would have learned a lot about much that is happening in India, and probably are also thanks to your insights and the ways in which you connected this to broader issues, are drawing away lessons for questions of democracy, questions of information technology, questions around one's sort of what happens when you're just simply going about using your computer. Questions of evidence, questions of the legality of digital evidence, etc., but also learning about the caste and class basis for so much that is happening in India today, and a lot of the kinds of issues that we often get clouded under sort of broad categorizations. Well, it's a third world country with lots of it's an imperfect democracy, or so on and so forth. I think all of the points that were raised today by the panelists helped to shed very valuable critical light on all of these issues. Thank you so much for taking the time and for your enthusiastic participation. We should probably sign off now. We've gone 15 minutes over time.
Thank you. Thank you all.
In the spirit of Jugaad, I think we can say that. I was also thinking of one more. Look what the rat dragged in, right?
Lovely.
Let's continue these conversations further. Thank you all for being here. See you.
Thank you.
Thank you for organizing it.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.